Welcome to Random Assignment, everyone. This is not C-SPAN, even though you may think from that Washington Journal C-SPAN on the bottom right of the screen that in fact is C-SPAN. No, it's not. It's Random Assignment with the great Corey DeAngelis of American Federation of Children, and I'm Bob Bowden of Choice Media. Corey, how you doing?
Doing pretty well. It's a nice day in D.C. And by the way, it's American Federation for Children, not of children, or else you're calling me a child.
Okay. I have to think about that for a second.
That happens a lot because American Federation of Teachers.
Yes.
So people get the of and the for confused a lot. But speaking of American Federation of Teachers, this graphic, very well done, Bob, and your team put together. Are these real quotes?
It almost looks like a shocked face on the part of Ms. Weingarten, the president of the AFT there. Not only are those real quotes, we have actually a bit of a surprise right now. We're going to release this for the first time, but we compiled not just all the callers, some of the callers that called into Randi Weingarten when she was this week appearing on Monday. She appeared on C-SPAN to take live callers. But in fact, this wasn't cherry picked. This was actually every caller.
Really?
Caller. Yes.
That was going to be my question next. Okay, I saw the video. I shared it on Twitter, and there was a bunch of negative feedback from parents. Here's some of the quotes. Public schools have failed these children. The union creates lazily, ineffective people. We'll play the clip in a little bit, but my first question was, is this representative? Is it, is this, 1% of the callers, or was it all of the callers? So you're saying every single call was negative like this?
She was on less than an hour, and there was a fair amount of questions from the interviewer, so the time was taken up that way. Also, Randi Weingarten's answers tend to be long, but so there weren't that many callers. But unless I'm mistaken, I'll call it 92% sure. This is an excerpt. At least an excerpt. It's not all of the calls, of course, but it's at least an excerpt, I believe, from all the callers who called into the show. So let's hear a sample of some of the things that they said to Randi Weingarten.
Get ready, everybody. This is 2 minutes of pure gold. Check it out.
Ms. Weingarten, I'd like to ask you why you think a pandemic is a reason to reimagine our education. And basics would be nice. The public schools have failed these children before on the education basis, let alone all this social re-education.
A parent, hello.
Hi. Yeah, I'm from Syracuse, New York, and as of the last few years, we've had under a 40% graduation rate.
The part that I don't understand is how come the parochial schools and the private schools could navigate their way through this scenario, but the public schools didn't seem to be able to manage that.
These kids these days, they can go to college, get some degree, and then it's not worth anything. They can't get a job. So if we really focus on a trade, that'll be a good way to path through the future, because right now, come on, let's be honest, a lot of these public school systems, you can't get any worse, so I invite change. Thank you.
Good morning, ma'am. Nice to meet you, and I mean no disrespect to you, but, this union thing, one time in our country, a union was a wonderful thing. Now the union creates lazy, ineffective people, and it also creates children that have no education. I look at my grandchildren. It is pathetic how the teachers union and the government has failed our children. I don't see how you could sit up there and defend that.
These people that were teaching had no idea about child development or any of those things. Another comment, when I grew up, my teacher, my principal, my fireman, and policeman lived down the street from me. We don't know them now. And inner city is even worse.
I'm telling you, they took you hear take a bite out of crime. They took a bite out of Randi Weingarten.
Oof. Epic. The public isn't having it with her gaslighting coming from her union. I'm sure you saw the Politico article kind of going to bat for the unions, pretty much celebrating their campaign to reopen the schools. A lot of people responded to that tweet. I was actually kind of thankful that there was like 1,500 replies. It gave me some faith in humanity once again, where people were like, what are they campaigning against themselves to reopen the schools? Because the unions were the major obstacle in reopening schools all along. But Randi Weingarten just continuously keeps repeating over and over again on these interviews, on social media, that they were, calling to reopen schools since April 2020 for over a year now. What are you talking about? You made it more and more difficult to open the freaking schools every step of the way so that you could extort more money from the taxpayers and hold children's educations hostage. Everybody for the most part that I've seen is not having it, and they're not allowing her to shift the narrative to make the teachers' unions, particularly her teachers' union, that directly influence CDC guidance to make it more difficult to reopen the schools. People aren't having it. They're not falling for the gaslighting, and families in particular aren't going to forget what's happened over the past year and all of the harm that her union has caused.
Corey, as great as you and I are, and as great as Random Assignment is, sometimes I just think we should just shut up and let Randi Weingarten talk. She's becoming so loathed over these talking points that have become so clearly lies. It used to just be things like tenure is really only due process, when in fact it was near infinite process. But now when they say we really wanted schools to be open, people can see lawsuit after lawsuit from Buffalo to Cincinnati, where they tried to keep schools closed. Her union in Philadelphia told teachers not to show up on a certain day, as even without a lawsuit, sometimes it was kind of a de facto strike where they were just told don't show up. We all watched it. It's all documented. In fact, there's a tweet that I have that has about 8 bullet points that I've been using over and over the last 2 or 3 weeks, which itemizes every one of these AFT, teacher union actions. So I just think people have had it. The more she appears, it's that you like to talk about the Twitter ratios, which are absolutely there. Every time she says anything, there are so many more people commenting against her than there are liking the tweet. But it goes beyond that. I mean, Twitter ratios, you could say, oh, that's, different teams and sides have their, core groups that can manufacture social media directions or something. But I just think that when you look at these C-SPAN callers, they're, I think, a pretty good barometer of how little patience people have left for her. Even as she's saying this, she's going on C-SPAN. She's making these points. What do you have? We have a story today. In fact, let's go out of order. There's from South Bend, Indiana, where they say, please just come, teachers, and go 40 minutes more 4 days a week to help these kids that have so little learning. They're so far behind. Can you just do that? Can you work 40 more minutes a day for 4 days a week? The teachers in South Bend say, hell no. If you scroll down, so try to square this. We're going to play more Randi Weingarten in a second, but try to square what she's saying with what people see all around the country in stories just like this, where, there you go, you got to vote on something that looks like that.
Yeah, these aren't correct answers, by the way.
Okay. It was literally the second paragraph there. 40 more minutes is what these teachers were asked to do Monday through Thursday. Why? Because of a massive learning loss on the part of kids. You think maybe some nurses were working 40 more minutes a day during the heart of COVID? You think those nurses were saying, hell no, we're not going to do it without more money? I don't think so. I think this is something that flies directly in the face of the narrative Randi Weingarten keeps giving on television in episodes like this C-SPAN show. And I think people are over it. It's no longer working.
Yeah, the jig is up, and the public school system, K through 12 at least, has received enough ransom payments from freaking Congress as it is. Just take the win and stop, playing with children's educations for over a year now. It's going to be a year and a half when August comes up. This is absolutely ridiculous. Families shouldn't have had to wait a day. They should have been able to take their children's education dollars elsewhere immediately, but a lot of disadvantaged families all across the country have been stuck with an inadequate system that is not responsive to their needs because they don't have any exit options. And particularly when it comes to places where the schools aren't even open for full-time in-person instruction.
One of the techniques you can see Randi Weingarten likes to do, she likes to use people's first names in a way to kind of warm them up, to pretend like she's friends with them. I think in this first clip, you can hear the C-SPAN interviewer begin to ask her a question about the Wall Street Journal. And she says, "Oh, please call me Randi by my first name." And I just happen to treasure how he rejects that attempt on her part to move it from an actual journalistic, serious interview to some sort of overly familiar cocktail party chat. So in this first clip, you'll see the interviewer ask her about a recent Wall Street Journal editorial, which used the term cha-ching.
And this is the other Randi video. There's only 2 that I have, correct?
Yes, I guess. I thought you had 3. I didn't send all 3.
Randi says
maybe
nothing.
You don't have that one.
Randi says nothing or something.
Okay, so then let's skip to this other clip. This other clip is when she's asked about the New York Post story about giving the language that ended up going directly from the AFT Teachers Union talking points into the scientific CDC guidance. And this is what she says about that.
Yeah, and by the way, this is so important because the way that the language was changed from the original draft, which is essentially word for word, verbatim from the suggestion from the teachers unions. The reason this is so big is because the way that they changed the guidance was to include community transmission rates, which was absolutely unscientific, but it also allowed them to make an argument that the schools should be closed for a longer period of time, harming more and more millions of children from having their schools shuttered. So here's the clip where Randi's admitting that they did that, but then they took it a step further where she says that the CDC actually asked her for specific language. Here you go.
Randi Weingarten, the CDC put out school reopening guidelines earlier this month. The New York Post had a recent story saying that your organization at least resulted in direct communication with the CDC with a couple of those principles being suggested by your organization and the CDC taking them. Can you explain what this story is about?
Well, the CDC was doing its job and we were doing our job and everything. So essentially what happened was the CDC in February and March basically asked all sorts of different organizations to sit down with them and give them comments about what they thought was important. They talked to parent organizations, they talked to the 2 unions. And one of the things that we didn't see in the CDC draft, and they explained what their draft was, is that that there were variants that were right around the corner. In Great Britain, look, there's this variant in India that I'm very concerned about. So this is normal rulemaking. Frankly, this is what every administration used to do. The problem with the last administration is they didn't do it.
So you call it normal, though, I guess in the write-up of the Post saying those 2 suggestions that you offered, at least your organization offered, make it nearly verbatim in the final draft. Do you call that normal as far as the ability to do that?
Look, Pedro, they asked us for language and we gave them language when they asked us for it. But if you look at the public record, I was saying these things publicly, these kinds of things. So there's nothing nefarious about doing this kind of work.
Act 3, Scene 2 of Hamlet. Queen Gertrude to Hamlet. The lady doth protest too much, methinks, when she says there's nothing nefarious. They asked us for language and we gave them language. Yeah, maybe you told them to ask you for language and then you gave them the language after you told them to ask you for the language. Yes, exactly. Like this is going to fool anybody anymore.
Yeah, I mean, this is really just confirms what a lot of us knew all along, or especially after the first 2-week closures of the schools, that the whole school reopening debate has had more to do with politics and power than safety and the needs of families. And we have 6 studies now finding that places with stronger teachers unions were less likely to reopen their schools for in-person instruction, all else equal, and a handful of studies also finding that the coronavirus risk in the area was not statistically related to the reopening of schools. So this hasn't been about science or safety. It's been about political science, if anything, political influence on CDC guidelines is nefarious because it had harmful effects on children because the union was looking out for itself to maintain a better bargaining position to get more and more ransom payments from the government. They may have not thought that they were doing anything nefarious, but in looking out for themselves and not giving options to millions of families and harming children because of that action, that is nefarious. That is a horrible action by the teachers unions. And like we said earlier, no one's falling for the BS.
I mean, fewer and fewer people are. It seems like this has been a turning point. This, I guess, 2020 into 2021, we've watched the unions. I mean, what happened first is people started to just feel that it was political, right? You remember long ago, 14 months ago, when, we were starting all of this, and remember how different states were handling the COVID differently. And we began to feel this kind of political separation. And then we began to hear what the unions were messaging and how different some states were schools were a lot more open than others, even within a state. The charter and parochial schools tended to be open a lot more than the public schools. And then we saw state separation as well. Then people like you started looking at the actual correlation between politics and school openings and how it didn't match with where the virus was being transmitted the most, right?
Yep, totally. We put in all of the variables that we had, even controlling for household income, the race in the area, the age distributions in the area. Places with stronger teachers unions, 6 studies have found, were less likely to reopen their schools for in-person instruction, all else equal. And separately, we also found, and several other studies have found, that places that were more blue areas were less likely to reopen as well. But that was a separate effect from the teachers union effect. They were both significant separately. So that it wasn't just politics, it was also power, but not so much related to safety. All of these studies have found either a weak correlation with the COVID risk or no correlation at all.
And you watch callers call into the show on C-SPAN and say to her, why is it that we watch the parochial schools and the charter schools be open and they seem to handle it and the public schools seem to be closed? And what Randi Weingarten does is spin it and say, well, there were lots of public schools that stayed open. Of course, I'm referring to there were a few public schools around, generally in the red states, or there are places with absolutely zero COVID in the first few months that did stay open. If there was really no COVID at all somewhere in a little town in Montana somewhere, I suspect there were public schools that were open, but she doesn't cite numbers. She'll just say, but there were public schools that stayed open. And there were also some private schools that closed. That also being true, but it's her way of glossing over this obvious disparity while pretending like there's no difference.
Yeah, pulling one anecdote out of nowhere is not scientific evidence. It's not how you figure out how the world is working. Obviously, there's Florida, for example, has been open for quite a while, where they've provided the option of in-person instruction for a lot more students than other states in particular. But Florida also doesn't have as strong as teachers unions as they do in places like California. It doesn't mean that the teachers unions didn't try to take that same action in Florida. There were lawsuits
at the FEA, which is not her union. It's part of the NEA union, but the Florida Education Association sued to close the schools. What happened? Schools opened under Governor DeSantis and no increase in COVID. Florida in the middle of the pack of COVID states, and despite having the oldest population in America. So,
so they were able to do it, but it was not. But it was despite the influence of the teachers unions and the attempts at the teachers unions to keep the schools closed. So, of course, there's some states that did it, but it's because they were able to overcome the influence of their teachers unions. But in places like California, they're still struggling over there. You still have Zoom in the room going on. In San Francisco, we talked about last week, where they opened the day before the deadline to get the millions of dollars in relief funding to reopen the schools for one day.
Right. And even that's a case where if you think it's all about blue versus red, the San Francisco the city government sued its own school district to open. So I don't think the San Francisco city government is controlled by right-wing, radical, red staters. Last time I checked. And yet even they sued their own school district to reopen. Did you get the JPEG graphic that I sent you? I thought it would be good to show. Yeah. So let's show that. There we have that's a an 1800s era political cartoon of Boss Tweed, who was a figure in the you and I can in the Tammany Hall, New York City corruption scandals that went on back in that day. Back in the late 1800s. But we decided it would be a perfect description of what's going on right now with teachers unions and school districts. You see campaign contributions up there. You see a dude standing there. I'm guessing that's a cigar smoking backroom dealer saying teachers unions, we put kids first. But then the quote on the bottom, we're just going to need to hear that CDC scientific guidance in advance of the public see in case we have any quote questions. So that's how kind of we better do what we tell you so that we could have more power in the future and take advantage of the pandemic. Yeah, we just might have a few questions. We need the science in advance of the public seeing it because we're a private organization, right? And even though we have no, government authority of any kind, and no one voted for us, and the public didn't vote for us. We're a private organization called teachers unions. We still deserve a secret meeting with these government officials before the public sees it because we're special. And we also, by the way, give campaign contributions to the party that owns the White House. A lot of what Randi Weingarten does in particular is that she tries to defend the actions of them influencing the guidelines by saying something like, educators are a stakeholder and they should be consulted by the CDC so that they can have information about what's going on. But that's not what happened. They didn't just craft the guidelines and then share it with the stakeholders. It was the stakeholders or political influence changed the guidelines. That's not how science works. If anything, you do the analysis, you listen to what the science says, you create the guidelines, and then you share it with people. It's not the stakeholders don't get to change what the guidelines are. And that's what happened when in the case of the American Federation of Teachers. And I think that's why this is so damning, the report that came out from the New York Post. And Randi and her union want to bury that and change the narrative. So they're going overtime and trying to do that, getting on as many media hits as possible and tweeting as much as possible to try to change the narrative. But I don't think that's going to work for a lot of families. And hopefully it doesn't. Hopefully families remain vigilant and keep pushing back. I have a theory this will be the last time Randi Weingarten takes live phone calls from the public. I think she'll probably do interviews with friendly, compliant media in the future. That she'll do. But this thing of taking questions from the public who gets to just tell her what's, quotes just like those, the unions create lazy, whatever the rest of it said, ineffective people. You think she's signing up for a live phone call situation anytime soon? I don't think so either. But we'll see. I don't know. She likes to twist things and act like they're the heroes in this scenario, but they're not. They've been fighting against reopening for over a year, and that harmed children, and they don't get to pretend to be heroes all of a sudden that some of the schools are reopening. Some of them have reopened despite the efforts of the union, not because of the efforts of the union. Yeah, I just love how she uses those first names on the part of the people that she's talking to in a way to seem warm. She's almost a construct. She's almost like a kabuki theater character. She's this character who has this persona, or she's an actress who goes on TV in these interviews to seem warm and sympathetic and caring. It's a voice she puts on, but when somebody then comes at her a little too hard, she'll use their first name again in a stern way to kind of say, now, wait a minute here. Now all of you know, we want to get back in the classroom. Anybody who knows in the soundbite that I did not send you, but it's on the Choice Media Twitter and also the Choice Media, you can look it up on Choice Media Twitter timeline. She says, yes, everybody knows who knows teachers. No, we desperately want to get back in the classroom. Just try to pretend you didn't see that news story about South Bend, about the teachers saying we will refuse to work 40 extra minutes a day. Pretend you didn't see the story about the lawsuit to keep Buffalo schools closed or Cincinnati schools closed or Chicago or LA or on and on and on. Legal actions all across the country. Pretend we didn't tell the Philadelphia teachers not to show up, even though the district said it's now safe enough to show up, come back to work. because you know why? I have that warm tone. And I want you to believe that I want you to feel my earnest sincerity. It's an act, and I don't want to sound like I'm kind of arm waving, to something that is obvious. I think in other words, but as if I've discovered some sort of clandestine trick on her part. I think everyone's figuring out the clandestine trick on her part, but it's punctuated so much for me. I guess I'm more angry than I would be because I feel that fakery going on of the first names and that tone of trying to pretend like she cares as she's keeping school closed, hurting kids, and more people realize it.
Yeah, and just pretend you didn't see all of the news stories about the hypocritical teachers union bosses in Puerto Rico vacationing poolside while railing against reopening the schools. Pretend you didn't see the Berkeley teachers union president sending his own kids to in-person private school, but then railing against having his members go back to work in person. Pretend you didn't see the DC teachers union members pouring into the streets and putting fake body bags in front of the public school offices to protest reopening. Pretend you didn't see the 2 national days of resistance where teachers unions, at least a dozen of them on at least 2 occasions, paired together with the Democratic Socialists of America to demand a whole bunch of political things in order to reopen the schools. Pretend you didn't see the Los Angeles teachers unions calling for Medicare for all, a wealth tax, a ban on charter schools, defunding the police in order to in their report for safely reopening the schools that had nothing to do with actually safely reopening the schools. People remember these things, and so every time a union boss tries to tell you otherwise, don't be fooled. I think Rory Cooper, a parent in Virginia, actually had a good article on this in National Review if you want to check it out. I think it's called Don't Be Fooled, and it's about kind of this theater and narrative shifting that is going on when it comes to the head of the American Federation of Teachers in particular.
All right, what else you got? Let's move on.
There's another thing in the Wall Street Journal that I haven't talked much about, but I thought it was interesting. I was cited in the piece, so we definitely have to talk about it.
Oh.
But it's by Ken I don't know how to say it. It says, now teachers unions face a remote threat. Why did Randi Weingarten pull an about face? Because not all families would choose in-person learning. So the whole thrust of this article here, which I thought was interesting, was that they point out that Randi Weingarten and the teachers unions are they're now talking about how remote learning isn't as good and in-person learning is the best thing possible. And their theory is that the union is capitalizing on this message because they understand that even when schools do reopen for in-person instruction, a lot of parents may have figured out, in some instances, that remote learning may be a good idea for their particular child. Don't get me wrong, this has harmed millions of children across the nation because overall it hasn't worked out for a lot of children academically, mentally, and with all these other problems going on with remote learning. But there might be some subset of parents who find maybe this is not too bad in their circumstance. And so in the long run, even when schools reopen, they might want to opt into remote learning in a virtual charter school, for example, which could harm the traditional schools, which are more likely to be unionized. So I thought that was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, no, it's and in fact, that story rolls out different places. In New Jersey, for example, they just announced there will be no online school next school year. So if your kid was thriving, and many did not, as we talked about before, in many cases, online learning just became phoned in by teachers, and they were all guaranteed zero accountability. In no way will your professional reputation suffer at all if you do the least of the least of the least amount of effort. That you'll be fine. They made that clear. And yet, some kids still did well because they just were self-motivated enough to just go through online courses and learn at a faster pace or learn at a slower pace or not be bullied or all the reasons we talk about. But yeah, New Jersey, they've said, forget it. Too bad. If your kid did well in the online learning paradigm, that will not happen at all.
Let's do a couple of good news.
Okay.
So I have two stories of good news. You sent me one of them, and it's not a done deal yet, right? But in Illinois, they have a tax credit scholarship program out there. And a lot of people were worried that they might have gotten rid of it or cut funding for it. And now there's this article in the Center Square talking about how their lawmakers on both sides of the aisle actually co-sponsoring a bill to expand their tax credit scholarship program.
Right. Right. Yes. This, despite, I think, a governor leaning the other way. And if I have it right, this is the program where the governor wanted to drop the tax credit from 70% to 40%.
Yeah.
This was done under the guise of a fiscal accountability premise. This was done, the governor saying, oh, I want to keep the tax credits. I'm not getting rid of them at all. All I'm doing is saying that if you give $100, instead of it lowering to this program, if you give $100 to help scholarships for kids, instead of your taxes being lowered automatically $70, now your taxes will be lowered only $40. So let's remove much or roughly half of the incentive for you to give this money. And so it's kind of, I think, a slick way to oppose school choice and oppose families having control of their own educational outcomes. Because he can keep saying over and over, I'm not good for getting rid of the program. I want the program to stay. I am just going to dwindle away the incentive for people to donate. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a way for you to say, oh, yeah, I'm for school choice. It's a fiscal accountability thing. But look, you save money when students switch out of the traditional school system. So you can't use the argument that you're saving money. And look, the reality is when you reduce the tax credit from 70% to 40%, you reduce the incentive for donating to this program, which means fewer scholarships for students who need them. And that's the reality here. But yeah, we're kind of optimistic at this point that there are co-sponsors on a bill in Illinois to, I believe it's to expand or at least not reduce their tax credit scholarship program.
They're fighting to keep it the way it is what I understand. But these state legislative stories, they tend to change every day and stuff like that. So. But at least, I mean, well, we wish them luck. I wanted to do an update, a little bit of, last week we talked about the debates ongoing about critical race theory and the 1619 Project. This has continued this last week. There was a local news television story, in fact, about in Georgia about a district where people were fighting from both sides on this. I also noted there was a congressman from Texas, Chip Roy, who has legislation that would ban federal funding for school districts involved in critical race theory teaching. And he had a press conference where he talked about it. And he actually kind of was urging the press to do their job. And so let's see this clip.
The veil has been lifted on a public education system that is corrupting the very ideal of being American. It is happening right now with federal tax dollars being taxed, borrowed, or printed recklessly with $6 trillion over the last year. That money is being funneled directly into public education institutions, K through graduate school, that are teaching our children that America is evil, divvying us up by race, teaching our children that they should be apologetic for their race. It's happening. This is real. Go look. You're the press. Go dive into this. Go look into schools. Ask them to see their curriculum. Dig into it. Be the press. That's your job, to go seek the truth wherever it may lead. One of the fundamental principles also in our founding. These things are true. In Evanston, Illinois, students listened to the book, Not My Idea, a book about whiteness. And parents were asked to discuss the book with their children at home. The book states that whiteness is a bad deal, and always was, and that you can be white without signing on to whiteness. Your schools, ladies and gentlemen, Americans, your schools, your tax dollars, your $30 trillion of debt being borrowed to fund those schools. You start asking the question, Why am I allowing my child to be indoctrinated by an education establishment that wants to teach my child that my country is evil? We need to end it, and we need to end it now. And that's why we're here. I've also introduced legislation, and it's called the Combating Racist Teaching Act, and it will make sure that all of our federal dollars, that not $1 can be used to fund a K through graduate school education if they're teaching any of these theories, any of this critical race theory stuff, any of it. No federal dollars. And I think we ought to stand on that as Republicans, because we stand for equality. We stand for equal justice under law, as written on that building right across the street in the Supreme Court.
Now, let me make something clear. I don't believe, and this may be disconcerting to some who want red meat only on this issue, red meat to the base. But I don't believe that this is. I don't believe that this is every school district. I don't believe it's every state necessarily. I believe it is happening, and we find anecdotes of it. But remember, it's not just this one issue. It's also issues of feminism and teaching boys that toxic masculinity is, something that's bad, that they're inherently masculine, and therefore they inherently need to be apologetic for that. Or the transgenderism that is telling kids that if they feel awkward in their body, well, it might be because they're the other gender, and they should consider hormones or some sort of surgery. There are all kinds of other aspects of indoctrination. In other words, it's not just this one of critical race theory that I think needs to be out in the open. And I think, of course, a lot of the Zoom classes expose parents to some of what teachers had been saying maybe for a long time. And so, at any rate, I think it also dovetails with something else. Another story I saw that I sent you from Connecticut. This one, a student being arrested for a racist post. And I don't know if we've talked too much about this, Corey, about whether schools should police social media. I think we brought it up a few times in the last year. But this is a case where a student was actually arrested under a hate crime legislation in Connecticut for what apparently seems like, I didn't see it, but apparently, according to this Associated Press article, seems like a racist post on social media by the kid. I was surprised the kid was arrested for a social media post. I thought to myself, I didn't know you could be arrested for any social media post as long as it's something in text. It's not some sort of a disgraceful image or something. But in fact, it was, I guess, under the guise of their hate crimes law in Connecticut. And it did make me wonder. It describes, in fact, in that story, that the essence of the hate crime law under which this kid was arrested, that included race as one of the things that you're not allowed to ridicule someone for. And I thought to myself, gee, I wonder if any white or Asian kids have been arrested for, I wonder if any kids of color have been arrested for ridiculing white or Asians. And I wonder if critical race theory or 1619 Project dogma could be considered ridiculing certain people based on their race. Anyway, I just bring this up because that was a surprising story, and I am troubled by all this culture war stuff.
Yeah, I want to go back to the Chip Roy thing. I haven't read the bill. It's a federal bill, and he's introducing to Congress, right? Something that I wasn't sure about at the end of the clip is he said something along the lines of this would ban all types, period, of critical race theory. And I don't know if I'm on board with that because, I don't know enough myself about critical race theory. I think a lot of us will think of critical race theory as what we're seeing in the media when all of these crazy things pop up, but there may actually be aspects of it that are okay. Certain ideas that might be okay. But, like some of these state level bills have explicitly listed like certain things like divisive concepts or, teaching people that they're one way or the other just because of their race. I think could be different from critical race theory as an academic kind of enterprise and how it was founded instead of what we're seeing in the media. So, yeah, I don't know where I am on that bill. I really think even if it was just limited to like the most egregious offenses, I don't know how effective it would be because like we talked about last week with San Francisco, this is just another top-down solution that, you know, you may not have a certain topic in your curriculum explicitly, but then you still may be sharing those same ideas in the classroom. And if you can't verify that it's happening and prove that it's happening, the kid's kind of stuck there and their parents are kind of stuck paying for it. It's better to just, I think, since it's could be difficult to prove and since there are ways to get around the rules, maybe better just to allow people to vote with their feet to other institutions. So school choice,
Well,
I mean,
sure.
either way, either types of bill in Congress right now, neither type has any shot of getting passed.
Listen, I 100% agree with you on the. It's kind of why I opened by saying this might be disappointing as for the base who once read me. But I think you're right. I think there are ways to present some of these concepts that would be seen as innocuous by me, anyway. Maybe most people, if I dare say. And so, I mean, when I first saw it and thought about it, I mean, let's admit this has zero chance of passage with Joe Biden as president and you know, Democrats running both houses of Congress. So, you know, but that said, I think you're right. It's like the Freakonomics guy said in the original Freakonomics book about how, you know, as soon as you make a rule, people will be figuring out ways to circumvent the rule. And if you, especially, nothing is more applicable to that than rules about speech and content, you know, where you try to subjectively say what ideas are allowed. You know, it's like bans of pornographic films back in the 70s, and you had people figuring out every, you know, way to circumvent. Anyway, the point is that yeah, I largely agree with it. I'll tell you. One other thing I was going to say is that I mentioned before that there was one of the, for good or bad, I guess maybe it's a nostalgic kind of vestigial part of my own career. But when I see local TV news covering something, to me that's sort of a measure. It's some sort of litmus test of general public awareness. That this subject matter has reached at least a certain kind of threshold needed of public interest to make it onto local television news. Well, I saw the story this week I referred to a second ago from Atlanta about this debate at a school board meeting. And it was people from both sides talking about critical race theory. I sound like Shatner right now. People from both sides. And so and what I was going to say was that I decided not to tweet out the clip. I decided to not pull it. I decided to not make it a part of this because I heard people from both sides at that school board meeting, and I couldn't tell, based on what I was hearing, which side I would have agreed with if I actually had been exposed to the real curriculum. Like, I thought that the people against this material, calling it toxic critical race theory, maybe they had been right, but then I heard the other people saying, no, this is just content that says the golden rule and treat other people like you'd want to be treated. And it doesn't say you are different. It says you are not different. And that's what this curriculum says. And at the end of it, I was like, I don't know who's right here. So I don't want to present it as if this is another example of critical race theory that I'm condemning.
I have another piece of good news from Texas. Just happened yesterday. If you recall, we shared a few weeks ago. I always forget. I just say a few weeks or a couple months ago because things are just happening so quickly. But I went to Texas and testified in favor of a bill that would provide $1,500 in direct funding to students with special needs in Texas public schools. That could be charter schools or traditional public schools. And there were actually lobbyists that came out on the part of the system when I was out there. A couple of them testified against it because they were arguing, nah, the money needs to go to the system. It can't. Even though the families are keeping their kids in our institutions, we're going to oppose the $1,500 because we would rather have it come to us. And that just passed. It passed the Senate already, 21-9. And yesterday it just passed the Texas House Public Education Committee 10-1. And there was actually a group that is notorious for defending the monopoly switched their side on the bill yesterday because of all there's no good argument to oppose this type of bill. I mean, it's even if you're a monopoly supporter, this bill gives $1,500 per student with special needs to students in your system, in the public school system. One of the groups is Raise Your Hand Texas, for example. They are pretty adamantly anti-school choice, but they flipped their position, I think, from against the bill to on the bill. I think on the bill is maybe neutral. I don't know if on is the same thing as for. But anyway, it's going to the full House for a vote soon, hopefully tomorrow even. But that's a bit of good news from Texas.
Yeah, we've said this before, and it's not a new idea. A lot of people are saying it, but all of this, the shower of printed money landing in traditional public schools with these trillions of dollars for the CARES Act and all these other Biden federal payments, it's created a scenario where the traditional public schools, they just can't very well sell that old argument of you're taking money away from public schools anymore. That's just not working, is it? And I realize this bill does pertain to kids who are already in public schools, but I'm just saying that when you see a lot of these things.
Their argument was, it's for our customers in the public schools, but you should give it to us, not the parents, because you can't trust those parents to be able to make the decision with the funding. You got to give it to the owners of the buildings, the system, rather than the customers. The way that I testified on it a couple weeks ago or a month ago, whatever it was I like to use analogies. So I laid out the analogy that just imagine if HEB, which is a big grocery store in Texas, hired lobbyists to come out to testify against the bill that would have given their customers on their loyalty program $1,500 a year. Why would they ever do that? That wouldn't make any sense. Yet you had people as a part of the establishment coming out against $1,500 per year per student for students with special needs in their schools. Yeah. Absolutely ridiculous. It just, after a while, I think they just couldn't defend that position. They looked really bad during that testimony, and truth prevailed yesterday in Texas. So that's great. I would argue it should be for all students, whether you're in a private or public school. But hey, any way to reallocate funding from buildings to students, I don't care what sector you're in, I think that's a good idea.
So a second ago, I said one metric I use for whether an issue has reached some sort of threshold of public awareness is local news coverage. Another is a couple of big YouTubers, one being Tim Pool, which one Corey DeAngelis once appeared on the Tim Pool Show. But the Tim Pool Show is another show, kind of in a way like the Joe Rogan Show, that a lot of people who are independents, who are not political partisans so much on either side, will listen to, and it's kind of the town square in a way on a lot of issues. And so we saw our favorite issue, school choice, come up on the Tim Pool Show just last week with the Fox News meteorologist, Janice Dean, talking about what she did during COVID.
You talk about us in COVID, but the kids, my children, 12 years old, 10 years old, wearing those masks in school when there's hardly any risk for them to get it, going outside for a 10-minute mask break, not being able to socialize with their friends, having plastic around their desks. It is soul crushing. I mean, he's going to remember this for the rest of his life. It's just it's a year that they have lost. And the teacher thing. I mean, I haven't talked about this a lot, but my 10-year-old had an issue with the online learning. He just was not able to really process the information through the iPad, and it was getting to the point where he wasn't learning anything. And so we put him in Catholic school because they were going to school. The teachers were there. They were in person. And we made that decision because he just was having such a hard time doing this remote learning. And I talked to so many parents that are worried about their kids that went through a year of this that really didn't learn much of anything. I saw, my child go through this just, trying to focus on the screen and not being, my Theodore is somebody that needs to be interactive with people and have someone in front of him sort of, showing him. So I really think that I had to do the right thing and get him back into school because that's the way he learns the best.
And it's a private Catholic school, so you're probably getting, I'm not trying to disparage public schools, but I imagine it's better.
In some ways, yeah. I mean, my other son is still in the public school, but he had no problem sort of doing that transition at home. So I have one in the, the public school, which I love. I was brought up in the public school system. But for my other son who needed to have that interaction, and I will say the Catholic schools did it better.
One size doesn't fit all.
Kind of a long clip there, but some people who didn't even watch this, who wanted to hate on this immediately, they didn't watch it, and they said, "Oh, another Fox News channel bashing the public schools." It's like, no, one of her children is in the public school. You can't dismiss it that way very well when her own child is in the public school. And yet she also very clearly explained that the Catholic school was open for in-person and her public school was not.
Yeah, and it just goes to show that one size doesn't fit all, that for one child in the same family unit, the public school is the better option, given that it's quote-unquote free. Maybe it wouldn't have been the better option if it wasn't free, but
right.
That's another conversation altogether. But for the current situation, she had one in private, one in public. And she wasn't on there bashing public schools. It just wasn't the right fit for one of her children. And I think the other side wants to paint all of us as being anti-public school because they know that there are people like Janice Dean who are cool with the public schools. And they want to paint us as being anti-public school so that they can get the third party watching the interaction to not listen to us. Whereas we all the time repeat that we're okay with you choosing the public school. We don't have any certain goal of having a certain percentage of people in the private sector. If the same number of people were in the public school system and the private school system as they are today, and they all had an option to change, I'd be perfectly happy with that. The goal isn't to get everybody out of the public school system. The goal is to make everyone have the option, or to allow everybody to have the option to choose either sector. Private schools shouldn't be limited to a certain segment of the population.
Imagine if Pell Grants for higher education only applied to public universities. And we came along to say, hey, I got a great idea. Why don't we let people go to any university with their Pell Grant? Wouldn't that be a great idea? That way, maybe there's a private university that fits one student better, or for all kinds of reasons we don't even know about their own lives. It could be the geographic location of the private university. It could be the program. It could be a sibling that's already there. It could be all kinds of other things, or a friend that's already there. So yeah, imagine what people would say. I mean, that's what this debate is. People would people then say, oh, well, no, that's taking money away from the public university that has a monopoly on that Pell Grant. No one says that, because Pell Grants can be used at public and private universities.
Yeah, maybe if we were in an alternative universe where all of the funding for higher education was followed you to a residentially assigned government-run university, that system would probably fight against any change to change that, just like we see with K-12. But you're right, we don't have that weird setup in the current day, because people understand that you should be able to choose your higher educational institution. So we should.
And everyone knows it would be preposterous. Everyone knows if a politician came along and said, I've got a great idea. Let's say if you want to use any government scholarships, you can only attend your physically closest state university. That would be a vastly unpopular proposal. No one would ever think to say that. It's stupid. No one would like it. And yet that's what we have in terms of K through 12 education.
You can't go to Harvard with your Pell Grant. Not allowed.
I know we're short on time. I just wanted to complain right now about my lighting and why I look like an albino and you look like a tanned sun god over there. And I'm like, what's going on? I got to change my lighting or something.
It's because I've been in the sun a lot in DC. It's finally not raining every day. So it's been a little nicer. Yeah. But one other, we don't have enough time for another story. We'll save it for next week. But yeah, I just want to say thanks everybody for checking us out again this week on the Random Assignment Podcast. We'll be back soon. And yeah, just one more. It's not a story, but it's a shameless plug for American Federation for Children. We now have fundstudentsnotsystems.org. And if you go to fundstudentsnotsystems.org, it'll take you to this page. You can sign up to get more information about school choice in your state. We're trying to build a coalition of families to fight back against the teachers unions. fundstudentsnotsystems.org. Check it out.
All right, everybody. And from the People's Republic of New Jersey, I bid you farewell. We'll see you next week.